An older black woman, dressed simply, stepped into the first-class cabin with a calm demeanor. No one could have guessed that her quiet presence would mark the beginning of a profound wave of change within a prestigious airline. The self-satisfied flight attendants, harboring subtle biases, dismissed her based solely on her appearance. They had no idea that this woman was the biological mother of one of the most powerful CEOs in the aviation industry. Evelyn Rhodes wore an old tracksuit, a dark sweatshirt, and slightly faded pants. Slung over her shoulder was a backpack that had been used for many years, and on her wrist was a small silver bracelet, the only keepsake left from her late husband, something she had never parted with in decades. Her eyes were calm, yet resolute. Each of her gentle steps seemed unaffected by the rush of the surrounding crowd. No one at Altura Airport that day knew that the woman with the ordinary appearance, standing amidst the throng of travelers, was in fact the mother of Dominic Langston, the billionaire black CEO, head of a tech conglomerate, and also the owner of the elite airline Altura Air. Evelyn had always chosen a humble and private life. Although her son had invited her numerous times to appear before the media or attend major events with him, she had always gently declined. To Evelyn, peace, simplicity, and daily life connections were far more valuable than any fame or luxury. As she approached the small coffee stand in the waiting area, she smiled and ordered a hot black coffee. The barista smiled back and asked kindly, "Where are you heading today?" "Ma'am," Evelyn replied softly, her voice like a gentle breeze. "I'm flying to Stonebridge, where my husband and I spent the most beautiful years of our lives." In her eyes at that moment, there was a tender longing distilled from lived memories. After receiving her coffee, Evelyn carefully made her way to the boarding gate for Altura Air Flight 782 to Stonebridge. There was no sign indicating she held any status. She stood quietly in the boarding line, carrying the composed air of someone seasoned by life, concealing power and renown beneath absolute simplicity. The boarding announcement for first-class passengers rang out. Evelyn calmly approached the priority boarding lane. Judging glances swept over her, a black woman in an unremarkable outfit among the neatly pressed suits and expensive perfumes of the first-class section. But Evelyn merely smiled gently. She did not know that her choice of modesty today would be the beginning of a series of events that would change her life and the lives of others. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, morning sunlight filtered across each of Evelyn's steps. She paused briefly to check the seat number on her electronic ticket, then made her way to the window seat 2A. But as soon as she sat down, something in the air made her look up. Standing near the entrance to the cabin was a white flight attendant, her gaze piercing through Evelyn. Her name was Madeline Cross. In Madeline's expression was a mixture of doubt and discomfort, as if she was trying to determine whether the black woman in old clothing had mistakenly taken the wrong seat. From behind, a male flight attendant approached. Colton Reeves, tall, well-groomed blonde hair, and usually bearing a constant smile, now had a different look. His smile had vanished in an instant. He stared at Evelyn suspiciously and whispered to Madeline, "Are you sure she's in the right seat?" Madeline nodded slightly, her voice low, but unable to hide her disdain. "I think we should double-check. This doesn't look quite right." That brief exchange did not go unnoticed. At the front of the cabin, a woman with elaborate curly brown hair and an air of elegance stepped forward. Genevieve Harlow, the lead flight attendant for first class. She observed Evelyn from a distance with a piercing stare, then furrowed her brow slightly. With her years of experience, Genevieve believed she could always identify premium clients at first glance. But this woman with her modest appearance and dark brown skin did not fit the profile of someone she considered worthy of a first-class seat. "Check the passenger's name for me," Genevieve instructed coldly, her gaze full of judgment as it passed over Evelyn. "Genevieve Harlow, as always, was confident in her ability to read passengers with just one glance. To her, those deemed worthy of sitting in Altura Air's first-class cabin always possessed a certain appearance, elegant, refined, and of course, never a black woman in worn-out clothing like Evelyn Rhodes. So, from the very first moment she laid eyes on her, Genevieve had already formed a silent judgment. She doesn't belong here. Check the passenger's name for me. She ordered Madeline Cross coldly, her eyes sharp as a blade slicing across Evelyn, filled with suspicion and prejudice. We're about to take off, and I don't want any trouble. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat quietly by the window, opening an old book from her backpack. The familiar words brought her a sense of peace, or at least she wanted to believe so. But the constant glances directed at her made the surrounding atmosphere grow heavier by the minute. All her life. Evelyn had grown used to those probing stares, subtle yet steeped in discrimination. From condescending looks to the smallest of gestures, every part played into a deeply rooted system. After Genevieve's curt nod, Colton Reeves silently picked up his tablet, pretending to check the passenger information, yet his eyes continued to dart toward Evelyn, occasionally whispering something to Madeline, and the two would share a mocking smirk. In that laughter was an unhidden contempt, a silent offense as sharp as a knife. To them, the idea of a modestly dressed black woman sitting in first class was unacceptable. Genevieve observed from afar, her eyes tracking Evelyn's every movement, from the way she sat, the way she opened her book, to each composed breath. Everything about Evelyn irritated her, because in her mind, elegance and status could never go hand in hand with dark skin and a faded tracksuit. The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Though no one spoke up, many passengers began to sense something was wrong. Some cast curious glances, others turned away, pretending not to notice. Evelyn maintained her calm, her eyes gazing out at the sky beyond the window, as if silently declaring to the world that she had every right to be here just like anyone else. But deep inside, she could feel that something unpleasant was coming, and it came. From the rear of the cabin, Colton approached with a veneer of politeness, but his eyes said it all: prejudice, doubt, and a hint of satisfaction. He stood beside Evelyn's seat, speaking gently but with clear intent. "Excuse me, ma'am. May I check your boarding pass?" Evelyn looked up and met his gaze directly. Her eyes held no anger, no pleading, only the strength of someone who had faced injustice many times before. Slowly, she unlocked her phone and held up the ticket for him to see. "Of course. This is seat 2A, my seat." Colton took the phone, pretending to examine it far more thoroughly than necessary. Then he frowned, trying to appear concerned. "Are you certain this is your seat? It's possible the system made an error, or there was a mix-up with an upgrade." Evelyn drew a deep breath, her voice still gentle but firm. "I'm absolutely certain. I purchased this ticket, and it was confirmed. I don't believe there's been any mistake here." At that moment, Genevieve Harlow stepped in. Her gaze swept over Evelyn like a razor-thin blade, full of judgment. She offered a faint smile, but each word she spoke carried the weight of dominance. "Ma'am, this is the first-class cabin reserved for our most distinguished guests. Perhaps there's been some confusion with your seat. Typically, our passengers don't dress like that." Her voice was soft but struck Evelyn's pride like a dagger wrapped in silk. The cabin fell utterly silent. Some passengers turned to look, others watched discreetly from the corners of their eyes. Their expressions ranged from discomfort to annoyance and even a tinge of sympathy. Evelyn, drawing from a lifetime of hard-earned patience, responded deliberately. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the pain of yet another subtle humiliation rising once again. "I know exactly where I'm sitting, Asi, ma'am," Evelyn Rhodes said, her voice calm yet cutting. "I paid in full for this ticket, and I have every right to sit here just like any other passenger." Genevieve Harlow's face briefly flickered with surprise. Perhaps she hadn't expected such a firm response from the older woman. But within a split second, she regained her usual cold composure, her gaze sharpening, her tone turning even more pointed. "I just want to ensure that all passengers are in their assigned seats," she said. "But honestly, you don't resemble the kind of clientele we're used to. So I believe some doubt is reasonable." Evelyn said nothing at first. She remained silent for a few seconds, her eyes shifting from serene to razor-sharp, making Genevieve feel an unexpected discomfort. Then, in a clear, composed voice, she spoke. "I don't think the issue here is with my ticket or my seat. The issue is that you're judging me based on my appearance and the color of my skin. Isn't that right?" The statement made both Colton Reeves and Genevieve freeze for a moment. A few nearby passengers began whispering, their eyes turning toward Evelyn with clear sympathy. Genevieve looked momentarily flustered, caught off guard in a rare instant of unease, but quickly returned to her icy demeanor, as if denying all accusations. "I'm sorry, but unless you can provide a clearer form of identification," she said, "we'll have to ask you to vacate this seat so we can verify the information." Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She could feel the anger welling up inside, but she had learned to master her emotions. In this moment, she wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for every person who had ever been belittled and unable to fight back. "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn replied, her voice steely. "I'm in the correct seat, and I demand that this be respected." The air in the first-class cabin seemed to thicken. The flight attendants exchanged hesitant glances. No one had expected this modestly dressed black woman to be so unyielding, and none of them knew that she was the biological mother of Dominic Langston, the owner of Altura Air, the very man they all admired during company-wide meetings. But the situation wasn't over. The heavy silence in the cabin was broken by a frosty voice. Genevieve Harlow had regained her commanding presence. "If you are truly that certain," she said, "then I must ask you to present your identification once more so we can verify it. This is a mandatory procedure for the airline in situations like this." Though her voice maintained a facade of calm, the irritation was obvious. The phrase mandatory procedure was deliberately emphasized, as if to remind Evelyn that she had the authority here, that this was a first-class cabin, and Evelyn, who did not fit the standard, needed to prove her worth. Evelyn looked straight into Genevieve's eyes, her gaze filled with both disappointment and anger. She knew very well that this wasn't about protocol or error. This was a fight for dignity, a form of discrimination hiding behind the professional veil of procedure. "I've already shown my boarding pass not once, but twice," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "And I've noticed you haven't asked a single other passenger on this flight to provide identification for seat verification." She locked eyes with Genevieve and spoke slowly, articulating each word. "Why is it only me? Is it because of my skin color and the way I dress? Because I don't look like the customers you're used to serving?" Her words were like a slap in the face to all the pretense dressed up in professional jargon. Genevieve hesitated. A few passengers began turning to look directly at them, their expressions filled with discomfort. Some nodded in agreement. Others turned away, pretending not to see, as if trying to avoid the truth, now hanging plainly in the air. In that moment, Evelyn Rhodes was no longer just a passenger under suspicion. She was the voice of all those who had ever been misjudged because of their appearance, who had ever been insulted without the means to respond. But today, she had chosen not to stay silent. If you refuse to cooperate, we have the right to deny service and ask you to relinquish your seat to another passenger." Genevieve Harlow's voice turned icy, almost cruel. "I don't want to make this situation uncomfortable, but this is my responsibility." Colton Reeves, standing right beside her, immediately nodded in agreement, a condescending smirk clearly forming on his face. To him, Evelyn Rhodes was nothing more than a troublesome passenger making a fuss over something trivial. From a distance, Madeline Cross also threw Evelyn a scornful glance, as if she were watching a comedy play unfold herself the amused audience. The first-class cabin now resembled a stage, with Evelyn at the center, isolated, judged, and humiliated. Passengers began whispering among themselves. Some looked visibly uneasy with the blatant behavior of the cabin crew, but no one had the courage to speak up in Evelyn's defense. People were afraid of getting involved. They chose the easier route, silence. And it was that silence that cut the deepest. Over the years, Evelyn had learned that the silence of witnesses was far more terrifying and destructive than any cruel word. But she did not bow her head. She stared directly at Genevieve, her gaze sharp as a blade. In a voice that was clear and strong, she spoke loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "I refuse to show identification simply to prove something you already know. I've presented a valid ticket, followed every procedure like every other passenger. Demanding additional documents just because I'm different is completely irrational and unjust. This is a clear act of racial discrimination." Her words hit like a bolt of lightning. For a moment, the entire first-class cabin fell into a dead silence. Genevieve and Colton froze. The term discrimination was something they always avoided, always denied. But today, it had been said, plain and resolute. Even the whispering passengers fell silent at once. Genevieve tried to maintain her composure, but her eyes betrayed her unease. She turned to Colton and said in a low but firm voice, "If she refuses to cooperate, contact ground support. Prepare for the worst-case scenario." Colton said nothing, just nodded and left the cabin, leaving Evelyn more alone than ever. She sat upright, hands resting gently on her lap, her eyes gazing out the window, trying to maintain an air of calm. But inside her raged a violent storm of humiliation, of suppressed fury. None of those around her knew that the woman they were turning a blind eye to was the mother of Dominic Langston, the powerful CEO who had built the very airline they were flying on. And none of them realized that it was precisely this apathy and silence that made the situation impossible to resolve quietly. Evelyn looked out the window, the scene beyond blurring under the light and hidden tears. In her heart, a vow began to form. She would not forget this day, not just for herself, but for the thousands like her who endured daily humiliation, masked as professionalism and unspoken prejudice. Suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed from the rear of the cabin. Colton Reeves returned this time, not alone. Beside him was a security officer, tall, stern, his eyes sharp like a programmed response unit for emergencies. He glanced briefly at Evelyn, but his look was the kind that measured a threat, not a person. Colton leaned toward Genevieve and whispered, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear deliberately, "I've notified ground staff. If she continues to refuse, we can remove her from the first-class cabin." Genevieve nodded, her face expressionless. Her eyes swept over Evelyn once more this time with the look of someone who believed they had already won. Cold, arrogant, contemptuous. Then, Genevieve Harlow strode directly toward Evelyn, standing squarely in front of her, as if to declare, "I'm the one in charge here." Her voice now carried none of the false politeness from before. What remained was pure command, wrapped in a veneer of protocol, "Ma'am. I've tried to be polite, but you have refused to provide identification. In this case, we are required to ask you to vacate your seat. In this case, we are required to ask you to vacate your current seat and move to a more appropriate location. Genevieve Harlow's voice grew firm, stripped of any remaining courtesy. We don't want to cause any further disruption to this flight. Evelyn Rhodes looked straight into her eyes. In her gaze was a blend of disappointment and anger, but beneath it all was a deep, lingering pain, the kind only those who have been subtly demeaned can truly understand. She knew, with complete clarity, that this was no longer about procedure or confusion. This was a public humiliation rooted in prejudice against her skin color and appearance, but she also understood that if she kept resisting, it would only escalate the situation and create more chaos, something that would affect innocent passengers who had done nothing wrong. In that moment, she felt as though her soul were being torn in two one-half, yearning to fight back, the other desperate to shield others from the fallout of a conflict she hadn't started. And perhaps the most painful part was the coldness and distance in the eyes of those around her. Not a single person stood by her. No one spoke up. They turned away, avoided her gaze, as if pretending not to see would make the injustice disappear. The isolation hung heavy, like a dark, suffocating curtain. But Evelyn did not let it break her. After what felt like an eternity of silence, she slowly rose from the first-class seat, the one she had paid for, with her own money. Every step away from that seat felt like a blade slicing into her dignity, into the self-respect she had spent a lifetime protecting. But she held her head high. There was no pleading in her eyes. And when she stood up fully, she spoke loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "I'm leaving, not because I'm wrong, but because I don't want to disturb the other passengers on this flight." Her voice was low, but it rang out with force. In her eyes was a pride no one could take from her. "But I want you all to know something," she continued, every word as sharp as steel. "This story isn't over. I will return. And when I do, I will demand justice not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever endured the kind of discrimination I've faced today." Genevieve Harlow froze for a split second, but she quickly regained her posture, turning aside as if clearing the path for someone she no longer believed deserved to be there. Colton Reeves and the security officer quietly followed Evelyn, as though escorting a threat. In reality, she was just an elderly woman who had been publicly insulted without apology, without anyone to defend her. As Evelyn walked past the rows of first-class seats, passengers' eyes followed her, some with pity, but far more with avoidance, as if she were a stain, something that didn't belong in that luxurious space. Still, she kept her head held high, and to herself, she said, "Today will be the spark that lights the fire of my fight. I will no longer be silent. And you will have to face the truth, at the dividing door between first class and economy." Evelyn turned and looked directly at Genevieve and Colton one last time. Her eyes burned with fierce resolve. One day, you will understand that a person's worth is not defined by the color of their skin, their clothing, or their seat. And when that day comes, I hope you remember today, remember exactly what you did to me. Genevieve stiffened. Colton looked away, as if afraid that meeting her gaze would burn him with the truth. Evelyn said nothing more. She stepped through the door, leaving behind a space where prejudice had just claimed a temporary victory. In the economy cabin, she quietly took a cramped seat, surrounded by rows of tightly packed passengers, far from the judgmental eyes of first class. But within her, there was no shame, only an unshakable belief in the mission ahead. She would not stop. She would not stay silent. She would return not just for herself, but for the thousands who had been disrespected like her. Outside the small window, the plane continued its silent passage through layers of white clouds, leaving behind the city of Bridgemont, where Altura Air had taken off. And high above the sky, one woman was still fighting, not with force, but with resilience and dignity. As soon as the plane landed at Stonebridge International Airport, Evelyn Rhodes quickly stepped off the aircraft. She no longer moved slowly. Her steps now carried unmistakable determination. The moment she exited the jet bridge, she pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with dozens of missed calls and unread messages from Dominic Langston, her son, the founder and CEO of Altura Air. She didn't need to read them to know he was already aware of what had happened. Evelyn pressed the call button. The phone rang only once before a voice filled with worry and fury came through. "Mom, are you okay? I know everything. I can't believe this happened on my own airline." Dominic's voice was tight as a bowstring, every word strained with suppressed anger, but Evelyn knew her son better than anyone. She knew he was tough, decisive, and above all utterly intolerant of injustice, especially when it came to racial discrimination. And she also knew that with the rage he was feeling now, he was fully capable of firing those responsible on the spot. "I'm all right, Dom," she replied gently, trying to calm the storm in his voice. "But what happened today truly hurt me, not just because I was insulted, but because it proves that bias still lingers even within an environment you've tried to build as fair as possible." There was a pause on the other end. Then Dominic's voice came back, colder and more resolute than ever. "Genevieve Harlow, Colton Reeves, and Madeline Cross, they're all being terminated today. Altura Air has no place for people like that." Evelyn understood her son's pain. She knew he wasn't just angry that his mother had been insulted. He was devastated that his trust in his staff had been so blatantly betrayed. But she also knew that if he acted purely on emotion, the core issue would remain unresolved. "Dom, I know you're angry. I am too," she said softly but firmly. "But if you only fire those three, nothing will really change. People will see it as a personal retaliation." She took a deep breath. "The problem isn't just them. The problem is systemic, from the way people are trained to the way they think. And even deeper than that, it lies in the unconscious biases people don't even realize they carry." This time, Dominic didn't immediately respond. His voice softened slightly, but confusion still lingered. "Then what do you want me to do? How can I let them stay after what they did to you?" Evelyn smiled, even though she knew he couldn't see it. "I'm not defending them, but I want you to do more than just fire people. I want you to turn this moment into an opportunity to fundamentally change the culture of your entire company." Her voice grew steady, each word bearing the weight of a woman who had endured a lifetime of injustice. "You have the power to call an emergency meeting. Let every manager and employee see the truth. Announce a complete overhaul focus on rooting out racism, eliminating prejudice, and creating real equality." Dominic Langston was silent for a while. Evelyn didn't rush him. She let her son absorb and reflect on every word she'd said. At last, his voice came through, still emotional, but now tinged with respect. "I understand, Mom, but if we do this, you'll have to face the people who disrespected you. Are you ready for that?" Evelyn Rhodes smiled gently, but in that smile was a steel-hard will. "I'm ready. If it helps Altura Air truly transform, if it means others won't have to suffer what I did today, then I will." On the other end, Dominic's voice softened, but remained filled with determination. "I promise you, this will never happen to you again. Starting today, Altura Air will change from the ground up. Tomorrow morning, you'll stand beside me at the company-wide meeting. Everyone will see there is zero tolerance for injustice or discrimination." Evelyn nodded softly, tears threatening to fall, but her heart had never felt lighter. Today's pain would open the door to a better tomorrow. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows of the Altura Air headquarters, casting its glow across the large conference room on the top floor. The light was clear and brilliant, but it wasn't enough to lift the heavy atmosphere hanging over the space. Dominic Langston stood by the glass wall, hands clasped tightly behind his back, eyes fixed on the bustling streets below. He had barely slept all night. He'd spent the entire time preparing for this emergency meeting, one he had never imagined he would have to lead. At the center of the room stood a long walnut conference table, surrounded by luxurious leather chairs that had once made many feel proud just to sit in them. But today, those same chairs seemed to radiate a cold, commanding presence. One by one, the senior executives entered, their faces solemn, their eyes cautious. No one spoke. They quietly took their seats, waiting for Dominic to begin. Everyone knew this morning's meeting was unlike any other. Soon, the three central figures of the incident also walked in: Genevieve Harlow, Colton Reeves, and Madeline Cross. All three wore their usual smiles, their confidence seemingly unshaken. To them, this meeting was likely a moment of praise, a recognition for their professional handling of an unexpected situation during yesterday's flight. Genevieve, dressed in a flawlessly tailored suit, strode toward one of the central seats as if she were the lead figure in the room. Colton and Madeline took seats on either side of her, their eyes glinting with anticipation. None of them realized that their smugness, arrogance, and hidden biases were the true problems. The doors to the conference room closed. The enclosed space fell into a suffocating silence. Dominic Langston turned around, his eyes slicing through the room like a cold blade. He stood in stillness for a few moments. The silence stretched long enough to make everyone hold their breath. But for the three who believed they were about to be praised, that silence felt like an omen of reward. They assumed the young CEO was about to commend them for their professionalism in a difficult moment. Until he finally spoke, his voice cold, commanding, and as sharp as ice water thrown across their illusions. I didn't call this meeting to commend anyone. The entire room fell deathly silent. On the contrary, I'm here to address a serious incident that occurred on our Bridgemont-Stonebridge flight yesterday. An incident that has left me deeply disappointed and forced me to question the workplace culture we're supposed to be building. Dominic's voice was calm but unyielding. Each word carried a weight that made the executives around the table feel as though the air had thickened. Genevieve Harlow froze. The smile vanished from her face. She looked around, bewildered, as if unable to grasp what was happening. Colton and Madeline glanced nervously at each other, tension slowly overtaking their once confident demeanor. Dominic didn't give them time to recover. I've received a full report of the incident. An elderly black passenger was treated with severe disrespect, forced to leave her first-class seat, a seat she had rightfully purchased, because of bias and discrimination from our own staff. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Genevieve went pale. Colton swallowed hard. Madeline lowered her head, avoiding Dominic's gaze. Then Dominic looked directly at Genevieve. His gaze no longer questioned. It was a blade slicing through pretense. Ms. Harlow, do you even know who the woman you humiliated yesterday was? Genevieve stammered, her face visibly shaken. I don't. Mr. Langston. I was just following procedure. I was just following company procedure, ensuring that every passenger was properly verified. Genevieve Harlow stammered, trying to justify herself. But Dominic Langston cut her off immediately, his voice sharp as steel. What procedure permits you to humiliate a legitimate passenger? What policy allows you to judge and remove someone simply because their appearance and skin color don't match your personal standards? The room went dead silent. Genevieve couldn't utter a word. All eyes in the room turned toward the three frozen figures: Genevieve, Colton Reeves, and Madeline Cross. Dominic took a deep breath and continued, his voice steady and piercing. "The woman you humiliated yesterday is my mother, Evelyn Rhodes. It was as if a bomb had detonated in the boardroom." Genevieve's face turned ghostly pale. Colton sat up straight, fists clenched. Madeline bowed her head, shoulders trembling. The air became suffocating. Each word from Dominic cut through the room like a blade. "I want everyone here to understand something very clearly. Altura Air does not tolerate any form of discrimination. This meeting wasn't called just to discipline 3 employees, but for all of us to confront a painful truth that bias and racism still exist, quietly, within this very organization." He paused, his eyes lingering on the 3 faces drained of color, paralyzed by shock and fear. "I will not allow any other passenger to endure the same humiliation my mother did. Starting today, Altura Air will change at its core. Now is the time to act." The boardroom fell into a silence so deep it felt unnerving. No one dared move. Then, suddenly, the door opened softly. All eyes turned toward it and froze. An elderly black woman stepped in. She wore the same simple tracksuit that had drawn so much contempt the day before. But this time, her powerful presence, calm gaze, and proud stance froze the entire room in place. It was Evelyn Rhodes. Genevieve's eyes widened, her mouth agape in speechless shock. Her face had drained of all color. Colton sat rigid, fists clenched tightly. Madeline lowered her head even further, unable to meet the piercing gaze of the woman they had so arrogantly dismissed. Dominic stepped forward, gently took his mother's hand, and led her to the center of the room. His voice rang out clear, strong, and filled with a quiet pride and unmistakable sorrow. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the woman standing here, Evelyn Rhodes, my mother, the person who taught me about fairness, about human dignity, and about responsibility, and the very passenger who was subjected to prejudice and mistreatment just yesterday." A shockwave rippled through the room. Murmurs spread quickly among the executives seated around the table. Genevieve, Colton, and Madeline sat like statues. Panic and dread filled their eyes. No justification could save them now. Amid the storm, Evelyn Rhodes stood tall, her expression stern but free of vengeance. When she spoke, her voice was soft but resolute, like a river running deep beneath a calm surface. "I did not come here for revenge, not to claim special privileges. I came to remind us all that injustice and discrimination are not personal problems. They are societal ones." The entire room fell still again. No one moved. Her voice continued, echoing like a wake-up bell yesterday. "I was humiliated, but there are thousands of others who endure the same pain every single day without the chance to speak. I am just one voice among countless invisible wounds. I didn't come here for myself." Evelyn Rhodes spoke, her gaze sweeping across every face in the room. "I came to remind everyone that discrimination and injustice are not personal problems. They are wounds inflicted on society as a whole." Her words rang out like a bell in the thick silence. The air in the room grew heavier, as if every gaze was now turned inward toward each person's own conscience. Genevieve Harlow, unable to withstand Evelyn's steady, solemn stare, abruptly stood up. Her voice trembled. "Mrs. Rhodes, I truly didn't know who you were. I was just following procedure. I never intended to offend you." Evelyn looked at her calmly, without a trace of hatred. but her eyes held a depth that made it impossible to look away. Her voice was gentle, but unyielding like stone. "It's precisely because you didn't know who I was. That's what exposes the root of the problem. If I had been a white woman, dressed in luxury, would you have asked me for ID or interrogated me the way you did?" The tension in the room pulled taut. Genevieve was speechless. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Evelyn continued, her voice growing firmer, clearer, as if speaking for the millions who are dismissed every day. "You acted out of unconscious bias you don't even realize you have. And that's the most dangerous kind. That's the silent illness eroding organizations, eating away at people without anyone bothering to notice." Genevieve stood frozen, her face pale. Colton Reeves stared at the floor, gripping his hands tightly. Madeline Cross quietly wiped away a tear that had begun rolling down her cheek. Evelyn took a step forward, her gaze piercing into the soul of every person in the room. "I've lived long enough to know that punishing a few individuals won't solve anything. What we need is a change at the root, starting with how we think, how we behave, and how we train and build workplace culture." Standing beside her, Dominic Langston gently placed his hand on his mother's shoulder. His eyes reflected admiration and deep gratitude. He spoke, voice steady and resolute. "I hope no one in this room forgets today. From this moment forward, Altura Air commits to fighting every form of discrimination, not just to be a successful airline in terms of business, but to be a place where every passenger, no matter who they are, is respected and treated fairly." It was more than a statement. It was a vow. Genevieve, Colton, and Madeline now understood that their lives would never be the same again. Every action, every look, every word they uttered from here on would be scrutinized under the light of truth Evelyn had just illuminated. The room remained silent. Not out of fear, but out of reflection. Evelyn stepped into the center of the boardroom. Though small in stature, she commanded every eye with the strength of someone who had weathered countless storms. Her voice rang out calm, incisive. "Ms. Genevieve, let me ask you one simple question. In all your years working here, have you ever asked a white passenger, dressed plainly like me, to show identification when they held a valid first-class ticket?" Genevieve hesitated. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to explain, but closed again. She knew the answer was no. Evelyn didn't need to say anything more. Her question alone was enough to silence the room. Evelyn Rhodes looked each person in the room directly in the eyes, her gaze cold as steel, yet still laced with compassion. "I observed closely," she said, her voice not loud, but echoing in the silent room. "Before and after I boarded the plane, there were at least 3 white passengers dressed as simply as I was. None of them were asked to show ID. Not a single one was questioned about their seat. No one responded." Colton Reeves made a feeble attempt to salvage some dignity, his tone defensive. "Mrs. Rhodes, really? We didn't mean any harm. We were just concerned there might have been a system error that day. Our behavior may have been a little tactless, but it wasn't racially motivated." Evelyn didn't let him finish. She reached into her bag and pulled out a carefully prepared stack of documents. She placed them firmly on the conference table. "I spent the entire night collecting and investigating. These are compiled statistics of similar incidents on Altura Air flights over the past 3 months, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Out of 27 cases where passengers were asked to vacate their seats or were challenged despite holding valid tickets, 23 involved black individuals or people from minority groups. The room went utterly still. The board members sat frozen, faces pale. A few glanced at each other in confusion and alarm. Evelyn continued, Altura Air policy contains no clause that allows staff to verify a passenger's identity based on their skin color or clothing. So, I ask the three of you, Genevieve Harlow, Colton Reeves, Madeline Cross, what exactly gave you the right to treat me, and people like me, with such injustice? She paused, her eyes cut through every remaining pretense. It wasn't because I was dressed simply. It was because I'm black and because I didn't fit the image of what you think a first-class passenger should look like. Isn't that right? Madeline broke into tears. Her head bowed. Colton trembled, lips sealed in shame. Genevieve made one last attempt, her voice shaking with despair. I'm sorry. I honestly didn't think that deeply. I just thought. Evelyn interrupted, her tone final. It's precisely because you didn't think that's the problem. That unconsciousness is what led you to act on implicit bias, stripping others of their dignity without even realizing it. She looked around the room, now heavy with a suffocating silence. Racism isn't always overt, but that's exactly why it causes the deepest pain for those who endure it. I'm not here to condemn any one person. I'm here to make you all confront a painful truth that prejudice and discrimination still exist, woven into the very fabric of our spaces. Beside her, Dominic Langston gave his mother's shoulder a gentle squeeze, his eyes filled with pride. Stepping forward, he addressed the room, his voice firm, full of resolve and hope. From this moment forward, I'm calling not just for acknowledgement, but for meaningful action. Altura Air will implement a comprehensive training program on anti-discrimination and racial equity awareness for every employee. He looked each person in the eye with conviction. We will not tolerate any behavior that contradicts the values we claim to uphold. The room fell silent once again, but this time it was a silence of reflection and responsibility. Genevieve, Colton, and Madeline finally understood that from today on they could no longer run from accountability. They would have to face themselves, their mistakes, and begin the difficult but necessary journey of real change. Evelyn slowly stepped toward the conference table and opened the folder. Each page turned like an indictment. Her voice was soft, yet unmistakably clear. My case is not an isolated one, and it is certainly not the first time discriminatory behavior has happened here. Evelyn Rhodes turned each page of the dossier, her voice firm and unwavering, every word slicing through the silence that blanketed the boardroom like a blade. What you are about to see in this dossier is the clearest proof that our system has quietly tolerated, perhaps even encouraged, a culture filled with latent, yet dangerously pervasive, racial bias. Each page she turned felt like an indictment, accompanied by images, charts, and statistics evidence no one in the room could turn away from anymore. Evelyn continued, her voice lower now, but even sharper, like steel, hardening with each sentence. In just the past 3 months, I've documented more than 27 incidents of discriminatory treatment on Altura Air flights. Of those, 23 involved black individuals or ethnic minorities. They were questioned, doubted, even forced out of their seats despite holding valid tickets. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room. Many people began to bow their heads. The truth was no longer deniable. An older board member, William Harris, attempted to break the silence with a frail voice. Mrs. Rhodes, I'm sure what you've mentioned are isolated incidents within a flawed system. Altura Air has always committed itself to ensuring fairness for all passengers. Evelyn cut him off, her voice cold as ice. Mr. Harris, what's most terrifying isn't the overt acts of discrimination, but the unconscious biases we've convinced ourselves are harmless. It is the complacency of leaders like you that has allowed this culture of prejudice to embed itself into every layer of staff. producing these so-called isolated incidents over and over again. She turned another page and laid out specific examples that stunned the entire room. The case of Jamal Thompson, a black entrepreneur forced out of a business-class seat due to a supposed system error. The truth. The staff couldn't believe a young black man belonged there. Or Mrs. Rosa Mendoza, a Latina woman and one of the airline's highest-tier loyalty members. She was made to verify her status repeatedly, while white passengers were welcomed quickly and politely. Evelyn's voice rose with strength. All of these incidents were documented, yet internally reported as minor misunderstandings or technical errors. But this is not a technical issue. This is racial profiling, concealed by a system that masks it as harmless mistakes. Some board members covered their mouths in shock. Others bowed their heads in shame. Genevieve Harlow, Colton Reeves, and Madeline Cross sat frozen, speechless beyond any defense. Evelyn gently closed the folder. She turned to Dominic Langston, then addressed the entire room. Her voice soft but filled with undeniable power. I trust that none of you want to continue leading an organization where unconscious bias like this is allowed to persist. But real change requires us to face painful truths, and most importantly, to act. Dominic stepped forward beside his mother, his gaze steady and resolute. My mother is right. From this moment on, Altura Air won't just talk about social responsibility, we're going to live it. We will no longer look at profit and brand image in a superficial way. We will put human dignity at the center of everything we do. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't fear that held them, it was the weight of realization. No one dared object. Dominic Langston stood in the center of the Altura Air boardroom, his voice firm and clear, each word ringing out like an oath of honor. Any act of discrimination, whether unconscious or intentional, will be dealt with strictly and may result in immediate termination. He turned to the head of human resources, seated at the end of the conference table, his gaze sharp. I'm instructing HR to review all current employee evaluation policies and to design a new system, one where adherence to and demonstration of values around diversity and anti-discrimination are prioritized. A wave of agreement rippled across the board members. Many began taking notes not out of obligation, but with the genuine understanding that today's words must translate into real, measurable action. Dominic concluded with unwavering conviction. I know this won't be easy. But Altura Air must do this, not just out of social responsibility, but out of human dignity. We don't change for reputation. We change because it's the right thing to do. I believe every person in this room has the capacity and the responsibility to lead that change. The room seemed to witness a historic shift, not just for the airline, but for the thousands who had been overlooked and silenced for far too long. 3 months after that landmark meeting, summer gave way to the early golden leaves of autumn. On another Altura Air flight, Evelyn Rhodes sat quietly by the window in first class. The view outside was familiar, but something within her had changed. The sweeping reforms Dominic had promised were now beginning to manifest in the eyes, in the tone, in the conduct of the flight crew. Evelyn looked out the window, her thoughts drifting through the months that had passed. She had witnessed the new training programs, revised conduct policies, but more importantly, she wondered if something deeper had truly begun to shift in people, especially in those who had once caused her pain. Just then, a gentle voice broke her reflection. Mrs. Rhodes. May I speak with you for a moment? Evelyn turned. In front of her stood Colton Reeves. Gone was the cold stare, the smug expression from that fateful flight. Now, Before her stood a man with sincere eyes, a face marked by shame and heavy remorse. She gave a slight nod, her voice calm. Of course, Colton. He sat in the seat beside her, fingers interlaced, as though holding himself together before saying something he had long carried. "I've been hoping for this chance for a long time. I want to sincerely apologize to you for what I did that day. In the past 3 months, since I was reassigned to economy class, I've experienced things I never could have imagined." Evelyn said nothing, just listened quietly, her gaze patient and steady. Colton continued, his voice now thick with emotion. "At first, working in economy made me feel stifled, frustrated. I even asked myself why I had to be there, but then I realized those very thoughts were the biggest problem." He paused, his eyes distant, as if staring into the mirror of his former self. "I used to think first class was only for people who were worthy. But I was wrong. Over the past few months, I've met so many people, simple, wonderful people, and I've come to understand that a person's value isn't defined by where they sit on a plane, but by how they live and how they treat others." Evelyn gave a quiet nod, a heavy layer within her slowly melting away. Colton bowed his head lower. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I promise I'll never again let myself fall into the arrogance and prejudice I once held. You taught me that through your silence, your strength, and your dignity." Evelyn smiled gently. For the first time since that flight, her smile held no pain, only hope. Colton Reeves bowed his head, his voice choked with all the words he had never said aloud. "I used to think I had the right to decide who deserved respect and who didn't. Until one day, an older passenger also, black like you, asked me a question that left me speechless. Have you ever tried putting yourself in someone else's shoes?" A simple question, yet it pierced straight through the armor of arrogance he had long carried. Evelyn Rhodes looked at him not with the anger of the past, but with rare and genuine understanding. "I'm glad to hear you say that. Colton, recognizing the problem is the first and most important step toward real change." Colton gave a faint smile, the first during their conversation, not one of pride, but of relief. "I know no apology can erase the hurt I caused, but I want you to know I've truly changed. I've realized I carried so many unconscious biases, and now I'm determined not to let those thoughts control my actions anymore." Evelyn gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture, yet one that conveyed forgiveness and trust. Her voice was soft but deeply resonant. "I've never wished for anyone to endure what I went through. But sometimes, it's only by stepping into another's pain that we truly understand the value of empathy and respect." Colton nodded. His gaze had completely transformed, no longer filled with pride, but with humility and determination. "I promise you, from today forward, I won't just change myself, I'll use this experience to help others change. I'll speak out against unconscious bias, not just in me, but in those around me." Evelyn smiled again, a smile not born of satisfaction, but of hope. She knew this moment wasn't just a personal exchange between two people. It was living proof that real change is possible if one has the courage to face themselves. Their conversation quickly spread within Altura Air, becoming a vivid symbol of the cultural transformation underway. Now, change was no longer confined to policies, training modules, or corporate videos. It had seeped into daily behavior, into people's eyes, into the way they treated one another. From the executive floor to the cockpit, from the front desk to economy class, people began noticing differences and learning to respect them. Just 6 months after that historic boardroom meeting, Altura Air drew significant attention from the media, human rights organizations, and even competitors. But what made them stand out wasn't flashy slogans, it was concrete, meaningful action to dismantle bias and build a culture of real equity. Previously, when people thought of Altura Air, they envisioned an elite airline with luxurious first-class cabins. But now, the Altura Air brand had become synonymous with humanity, racial equality, and social responsibility. The story of Evelyn Rhodes and the comprehensive reform led by Dominic Langston became a powerful symbol that inspired millions. Major airlines across the U.S., like American Sky, Global Air, and Oceanic Airlines, began reaching out to Dominic directly, asking to share Altura Air's internal transformation model. Many high-profile CEOs admitted that they had once dismissed internal culture as a minor part of business. But now, the story of a black mother being discriminated against on a flight owned by her own son, the CEO, had shaken them awake. No one dared call discrimination a small matter anymore. No one dared hide behind the excuse, "We didn't mean it." Because now, even unintentional harm was recognized as the deepest cut of all. As the sweeping changes not only transformed Altura Air, but began to reshape the entire global aviation industry. Evelyn Rhodes once again stepped aboard the airline's familiar flight. No longer the woman questioned or asked to give up her seat because of her simple attire and skin color. She was now a living symbol of change, quiet, powerful, and deeply humane. On a flight from Astor Hill back to Fairwind, Evelyn was greeted not only with politeness, but with genuine understanding in the eyes of the entire crew. Every gesture, every greeting, came from a place of true respect, no longer the performative pleasantries of the past. Once the plane leveled at cruising altitude, a young flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Hello, Mrs. B. Rhodes. I'm Lena Caldwell. It's an honor to serve you today. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Evelyn nodded gently and returned the smile. Behind that smile was a long journey of pain, endurance, and ultimately, triumph. Across the aisle, a male voice called out, "Mrs. Rhodes." Evelyn turned. A middle-aged man with graying light brown hair, dressed in an Altura Air uniform, stood beside her. His face held a hint of tension, but his eyes were sincere and steady. "I'm Eli Grant, Regional Director for the Northeast. May I sit with you for a moment?" Evelyn nodded. Eli sat down and pulled a small envelope from his pocket, placing it on the table. "This is a letter of thanks from our entire executive board. But more importantly, I came here today to say thank you for changing us." Evelyn smiled softly. "I didn't change anyone. I just forced people to look directly at what they had long tried to ignore." "That's exactly why you changed us," Eli replied, his voice filled with gratitude. 3 months earlier, after the historic meeting at Altura Air's headquarters, everything had truly begun to change. Human resources was completely restructured. The evaluation and hiring systems were rebuilt from the ground up, with fairness and diversity as their leading principles. Unconscious bias training became a routine, not just for entry-level staff, but for management and executives as well. Most notably, an independent hotline was established to report any discriminatory behavior anonymous, secure, and absolutely transparent. The story of Evelyn, Colton Reeves, and Altura Air itself spread widely. The media praised it. Social media amplified it. Major airlines like American Sky, Global Air, and Oceanic Airlines proactively reached out to Dominic Langston, asking to learn from his corporate reform blueprint. At the International Aviation Conference in New York, when Dominic took the stage to tell his story, the story of the company, his mother, and those who had made mistakes but were brave enough to change. Like Colton, the entire hall fell silent. After his speech, more than 20 airlines around the world signed a joint commitment to form the Global Alliance for Equity and Anti-Discrimination in Aviation, a milestone without precedent. And the ripple effect didn't stop at aviation. Media companies, hotel chains, public service organizations, and even government agencies began holding dialogues and reforming internal policies based on the very principles Altura Air had set in motion. Evelyn turned to Eli, her eyes glowing with quiet pride. "We've done something extraordinary, but this is only the beginning." Eli nodded. "And we won't let this fire die." The plane glided gently above the thick clouds. In the first-class cabin, Evelyn leaned back into her seat, eyes closed. Her heart was more at peace than ever. Not because she had been vindicated, but because from her story, an entire system had begun to change. The atmosphere in first class this time was entirely different. Everything felt lighter, more peaceful, and filled with genuine respect. When Evelyn Rhodes stepped onto the Altura Air flight, she no longer had to brace herself for scrutinizing glances, unreasonable questions, or subtle disdain. Dressed in her familiar, simple attire, she settled into her window seat, her eyes gently observing the passengers around her. For the first time, she noticed the visible diversity in first class: a young black businessman deeply engrossed in documents, an elderly Asian couple smiling as they chatted. Further down, a young Latina woman quietly reading a book. Everyone appeared at ease, relaxed, enjoying their flight without worry, without the weight of suspicion or discrimination. A young flight attendant approached with a bright, sincere smile. "Hello, Mrs. Rhodes. It's an honor to serve you today. Is there anything you need before takeoff?" Her voice was gentle, her eyes full of sincerity, respect not rooted in knowing who Evelyn was, but grounded in the core values Altura Air now stood for. Evelyn smiled warmly. "Thank you, dear. A glass of water will be just fine." The flight attendant quickly returned with the water. There were no questions, no second glances, no requests to prove her identity, only attentive, respectful service, just as Evelyn had always hoped for. The plane soared gently into the sky, piercing through soft white clouds. Evelyn turned her gaze toward the window, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle over her. In that moment, memories of past pain returned, moments when she had to steel herself against words and actions rooted in prejudice, simply because of her skin color and modest appearance. But this time, those memories no longer brought sorrow. They had become the foundation for a new culture, one she was now witnessing with her own eyes. Her gaze stopped at a familiar face near the back of the cabin. Colton Reeves, the man who had once hurt her so deeply, was now patiently assisting an elderly black passenger with their luggage. On his face was a quiet dignity, a genuine humility far removed from the arrogance he once carried. Evelyn smiled gently. This was the change she had longed for, not in statements or declarations, but in real actions, where those who once caused harm had truly transformed. Colton glanced over and met Evelyn's eyes. He gave a small nod, his expression filled with gratitude and deep respect. The moment passed quickly, but it carried immense weight. Two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a painful truth could now look at each other with compassion and belief in positive transformation. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her mind more at peace than ever. She knew the respect she now received wasn't a privilege granted because she was Dominic Langston's mother, but the result of tireless efforts hers, her sons, and the many others who had dared to confront their own failures to build real change. That was the greatest victory of all. And Evelyn knew this wasn't her victory alone. It belonged to every black passenger who had ever been hurt. It belonged to every staff member who once held unconscious bias, but now sought to do better. And above all, it belonged to the future, a future where dignity and respect would be a given, not a luxury, regardless of background or skin color. Looking around the cabin as passengers quietly enjoyed their journey, Evelyn smiled with the deepest sense of peace. She knew the pain she had once endured had become a foundation for countless others. No one would have to suffer the humiliation she once did. The plane glided silently through the clouds, continuing its journey, and Evelyn knew that her journey, Dominic's, and that of all those fighting for justice and equity, was far from over. But now, the path was broader, brighter, and filled with more hope than ever before. She gently closed her eyes, a serene smile forming on her lips, not because she had been respected, but because she knew that from this moment forward, no one would have to carry the pain she once bore. This was not just Evelyn Rhodes' victory. This was a victory for all of us. The journey of Evelyn Rhodes is not just the story of a resilient woman who was humiliated on a flight. It is a symbol for the countless people who have quietly endured injustice and discrimination simply because of the color of their skin, their background, or the way they dress. But more importantly, her journey is living proof that if just one person dares to speak up, if just one heart is unwavering, if one soul refuses to be broken, then an entire system can change. From what seemed like a small incident, Evelyn and her son, the CEO of an airline, sparked an unprecedented wave of change, not just within Altura Air, but across the aviation industry and even into other sectors. This shows us that sometimes a painful event can become a spark that ignites thousands of hopes if it is led by heart and courage. Their story also reminds us true change doesn't come from grand statements, but begins when each of us dares to reflect inward, to admit when we're wrong, to learn how to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, and above all, to act for a world that is just, compassionate, and deeply humane. If this story moved you in any way, if it stirred something inside you, sparked a realization, or simply gave you a moment of reflection, then please help share this positive message. Click like to show your support. Share this video to reach more people, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next powerful, meaningful story. Because sometimes, just one act of sharing can shift someone's perspective. And who knows, you may be the one who inspires the next journey, just like Evelyn once did. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story, where kindness, understanding, and justice will always light the way.